Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our last session of Memory University for 2022. My name is Dr. Sophia Wong. I'm an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry at the IU School of Medicine. I'm also the Outreach Recruitment and Engagement Core Leader for the Indiana Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, which was funded from an NIA P30 grant. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this week's CME, which can be obtained live. sequelae has been a great partner in terms of our outreach to those caregivers and those affected by Alzheimer's disease. sequelae is a not-for-profit agency that helps seniors and people of any age with a disability to remain comfortably at home. And I encourage all of you to check out more information about sequelae at sequelae.org. So just briefly, please note the following CME information. And I will be moderating the Q&A. And before we get into my talk, I did want to tell you a little bit more about the story of how I became interested in cognitive symptoms after COVID-19 infection. I started off actually by studying how people who are in the hospital and developed confusion went on to develop long-term cognitive impairment. And when the COVID-19 pandemic occurred, one of the most obvious clinical symptoms of COVID-19 infection were these prolonged periods of confusion known as delirium. So I teamed up with my colleagues in the critical care medicine division and neuroimaging to eventually begin to study this crucial field. So I'm really looking forward to all of you joining me for our talk and for our subsequent Q&A. So without further ado, we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to my talk titled Long Haulers, Cognitive Symptoms After COVID-19 Infection. If you are attending this talk live, you are entitled to CME credit. Please be reminded that the evaluation for this activity get CME credit will be sent 30 to 60 days from the IU CME office. If you have any questions, you can email cme@iu.edu. Before we get started, I don't have any conflicts of interest. However, I am receiving funding from a number of grants through the NIA, as well as the Alzheimer's Association. I also receive funding for clinical work through the VA, book royalties from APPI, and serve as a DSMB consultant for an NIA-funded R01. So just a brief overview in terms of where we're going to go today. We're going to start off with a refresher about COVID-19. Then we're going to talk about what the relationship is between COVID-19 and Alzheimer's. Then we're going to touch on COVID-19 related olfactory dysfunction and the effects of COVID-19 on cognition in those who are hospitalized and critically ill. And then we'll go into future directions. This talk isn't going to be comprehensive on was such a vast topic. We won't be covering racial disparities in the COVID-19 pandemic. That was covered by Dr. Robert Russell in last week's talk. So if you didn't have a chance to hear it, I would definitely encourage you to take a listen on our Facebook page. We also are not going to be discussing the mental health effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, although we do recognize the profound effects of that. So just as a refresher, this whole story started, at least in the US, back in January of 2020, when in Asia, they began to report a deadly mysterious virus in China and then in South Korea. And then shortly, within a few months, New York was essentially seeing the epicenter of the pandemic as hundreds of people were dying and the morgues were strained to the point that you could see these hospital trucks right outside of major hospitals. And since we've gone through that time, that surge was the beginning of actually several surges that have now struck our country. We saw a surge in the summer of 2020, and then in the fall and winter, right as vaccines ended up coming just at the end in January for those at risk. Then we saw another surge with the Delta wave, and then as many people know, we have completed the Omicron surge, though we still are perhaps starting to see an uptick in some areas of the country, but the huge national surge was seen late in the winter from January through February. I think one of the biggest questions that I certainly hear and ask myself every day is, are we done yet? And I think we don't know if we're done yet is the short story. There's been some confusion about, what it means to be in a pandemic even. And I think what we're going to see are these ebbs and flows as, things may become quiescent and surge again. I think in some ways has contributed significantly to the stress that we've experienced from a mental health standpoint. And just to back up a little bit, just to make sure we're on the same page about the biology of COVID, this is a virus. And what it means is that one cannot actually transmit this infectious agent unless it's through a living, entity. So such as people. There's also been a demonstration of other species being able to contract COVID, and spread mainly through aerosol transmission. And the biology is such that the spike protein, which is labeled S here, actually will bind to a receptor known as the ACE2 receptor. And from there, it can enter the cells and then essentially cause infection. And it is actually against this S protein that our various vaccines have been targeting, though we can see there's a number of other proteins that are important, including the yellow protein here for replication, as well as other orange proteins that are important, that help recognize the cells that can be attacked. I think many of us are familiar that COVID-19 can cause a wide range of symptoms in various individuals. We see people are completely asymptomatic, about 50%. That in some ways has contributed to the sort of bimodal response to the pandemic. We see people have no symptoms versus very mild symptoms, perhaps a cough or a sore throat. And then we see people who have much more significant symptoms with moderate illness, defined as having some lower respiratory disease, but are able to oxygenate relatively normally on room air. And then those with severe and critical illness. And these people usually require hospitalization and much greater subspecialty attention. And it was during the surge recently with Delta and then Omicron that we saw overwhelming of the intensive care units and the need for assistance from the outside to care for so many ill patients. The timeline of infection for those who are, symptomatic is, really varies, but in general, what we see in most people is that at the time of exposure, or before they become symptomatic, there's about a week in which detection is very difficult or can even be false negatives. And then the infection can be spread for about anywhere from 7 to 20 days on average, I would say 10. And in those who show the acute symptoms of COVID-19, they do test positive with PCR in the nasopharyngeal swabs, and then they go on to develop symptoms, usually for a number of weeks, that can affect various organs of the body, including the lungs, the brain, the heart, the vasculature, and the kidneys, and even can cause hair loss. So I think I've mentioned briefly the symptoms of COVID-19. Again, we do classically think of it as an upper respiratory tract infection, but one of the unusual, sequelae of COVID-19, or rather symptoms during the acute phase, was that multi-system effects. And that made it very different from, say, the flu or other types of viruses we had seen before. And the other key aspect of the COVID-19 infection that was unusual is that people who had maybe very mild symptoms began to develop these long-term sequelae known as long COVID that had not been seen with other traditional upper respiratory viruses. And in fact, it was suspected that the prevalence is pretty high, perhaps as much as 1 in 5 adults. And I didn't even go into the pediatric end of things, but those does seem like children may also have sequelae as well. And as we can see here, neurologic and mental health conditions is one, as well as the heart, kidneys, lungs, musculoskeletal. And then the other key aspect, which we'll talk about a little bit more, are blood clots and vasculature flow. So one of the most common symptoms that people with long COVID often complain about is what they call brain fog. And one of the big questions we have is what's causing this, right? Why are some people developing brain fog and other people aren't? And in today's talk, we're going to begin to dissect why it's not such an easy question to answer, but then begin to look at some of the research data that begins to maybe touch the tip of the iceberg of answering such a complex question. So why is understanding long COVID such a difficult question? And it includes for the following reasons. Number one, there's a wide severity of disease seen with COVID-19. The second reason is that we also have a wide range of people getting sick, people who are very healthy, people who have a high number of comorbidities. And then we're also seeing a wide range of neurologic and cognitive symptoms. And this variation makes this question a challenge to understand. So the pressing question that has been on the forefront of people's mind is, what is the relationship between COVID-19 and dementia, if indeed there is a relationship? So the first question, does dementia in some way, worsen, COVID-19? The data for that are pretty strong. There was a really good paper that came out in Alzheimer's dementia showing that indeed dementia did increase the risk of COVID-19 infection, and equally as concerning, it also increased the risk of severity for COVID-19 illness. And then finally, and this is a question that we still don't fully know the answer yet, Blacks do seem to be at higher risk, just all comers, for the poor sequelae from COVID-19 illness, including hospitalization and death. And we saw that same phenomena here in that article, in which they found Black patients with dementia were even at higher risk of poorer health outcomes once they got COVID-19. However, the more difficult question to answer is, does COVID-19 cause Alzheimer's disease? Okay, so this is a question that many researchers are beginning to study, but what I'm going to put out here is how I wrap my mind around beginning to dissect the different pathways that can, connect these two phenomena, if indeed, again, there is a connection. So the first one is de novo infection. So that is somebody who's, fairly in good health and gets infected. The second concept is that of a two-hit hypothesis. So in other words, somebody already at higher risk, COVID-19 accelerating that cognitive decline dementia. And then the third concept is that somehow COVID-19, the severity of the disease and or treatments that are necessary, life-saving even for COVID-19, are also somehow affecting cognition in the long run. So de novo infection. These are people who generally have these cognitive complaints or deficits on the very mild range. They're functioning, but they're not functioning as well as they used to, or they have this sort of ebb and flow pattern. The mechanisms are not really well established. Some people have started to suspect autoimmune or neuroinflammatory pathways. But what we see, and this is, more heard of in younger folks without any illness, is that they get infected and then they have these cognitive complaints. In some cases, even mild cognitive deficits, primarily in executive functioning and attention. Now, the key question is, and this is still up for study, is do these people go on then to develop Alzheimer's dementia or some other type of dementia? The second pathway is what I call the two-hit hypothesis. That is, you take people who are at risk and you're accelerating that cognitive decline or that trajectory towards dementia. So these are people who already have established risk factors for Alzheimer's. People who are older, female, racial and ethnic minorities, those with vascular risk factors, or they may already, unbeknownst to anyone, have pre-existing neuropathology, such as beta amyloid plaques, even though at that time, prior to illness, they have no cognitive complaints, or vascular disease, cerebrovascular disease from vascular risk factors, such as high blood pressure or diabetes. And then these people get hit with a COVID-19 infection, and then that pushes them over the edge. They may start to develop subjective complaints. They might start mild cognitive impairment, or even tip over to Alzheimer's, dementia, or some other type of dementia. And the final pathway, as I conceptualize how COVID is related to Alzheimer's, is that of disease severity or treatment. And this mechanism is probably more related to those who have moderate, severe, critical COVID-19 illness. So the way to conceptualize this is that in COVID-19 infection, those who get much sicker tend to have symptoms that are already known to be associated with cognitive decline or dementia. These include delirium, stroke, hypoxia, i.e. lower oxygen levels, metabolic disturbances, and the other aspect is treatment related sequelae. So for example, we know that people who need mechanical ventilation for prolonged periods often are at higher risk for cognitive sequelae after leaving the ICU. And it also may be that certain medications that are crucial and need to be given as part of treatment can also, however, cause cognitive sequelae. These include benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, steroids. So by virtue of having to treat someone to save their life from COVID-19, at the same time, that may incur the additional risk down the road of cognitive decline and dementia. All right, so how serious is this problem of brain fog? Well, a recent article, and this has been corroborated by a number of other articles, suggests that it's a fairly common symptom. This one found it was around 81%. Some articles have found it to be lower, like in the 40 to 50%. But the bottom line is that it's a pretty prevalent symptom in long haulers, even those who don't require hospitalization. And a number of studies, including this one, have found objectively that there are attentional and working memory deficits. And this is a similarly large study in the course of hundreds. This is a study from the UK of over 326 people and who were not hospitalized, and they were found to also have cognitive symptoms. Now, obviously, it was substantial as well for people who are hospitalized, but this goes to show that even those people who are infected with COVID-19 have symptoms, do not require hospitalization, appear to have significant cognitive sequelae from their infection. So, where is this coming from, right? What are causing these symptoms? Is it stress related? We don't think so. Or is this a bona fide beginning of a neurodegenerative disorder? As I pointed out, that's still a question mark. But one very telling study done by the UK Biobank Group points to the fact that COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, may have some specific properties in terms of causing neuronal damage. They found that COVID-19 infection, mostly mild, was associated with 0.2 to 2% gray matter shrinkage. And I just want to take a moment. So this study is actually very fascinating because one of the challenges that we run into as researchers when a major event like this happens is that we don't actually often know someone's baseline from a neuroimaging standpoint. So these are people that had a neuroimaging prior to the pandemic for other reasons as part of the follow-up in this biobank, and then had neuroimaging subsequently afterwards. So that's why they were able to pick up such a small change. And even in the small changes, what they found were losses in gray matter that were important for olfaction and memory. And one area that we still have not yet figured out is whether these changes are progressive, whether these losses are reversible. And I think that's going to be a very instrumental a question to figure out as we continue to follow these people. So I mentioned loss of the gray matter in the olfactory region. And I think many people already know that olfactory dysfunction is a common symptom. It can be as much as 50% of those infected with COVID-19. Very curiously, it's often can be presenting as the only symptom of COVID-19 infection. And most people do recover within 6 months. However, there seems to be some dependence on the variant. We think that perhaps the olfactory bulb is less affected in Omicron, though this still needs to be further investigated. And what was very striking at the beginning of the pandemic was that when this olfactory dysfunction occurred, it wasn't accompanied by rhinorrhea or sinusitis, which we often see in viral URI. And not surprisingly, olfactory dysfunction and taste are closely linked. So people also complained of changes in taste. And this anosmia, this loss of smell, is thought to be affected by damage to the supporting cells for the olfactory nerve. So we'll get into that in a few minutes. But anosmia is actually not a symptom specific to COVID-19 infection. We can see that the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract, which is here, that can be affected by upper respiratory tract infections as well, head injury, sinus pathology, medications, and even neurodegenerative disorder. And though people don't often think about smell as the sense of smell is an important part of understanding brain function. As being cranial nerve 1, understanding olfactory functioning can actually provide a window into the central nervous system and cognition. So what were some of the symptoms noticed in COVID-19? Well, most people complained of anosmia, but people also complained of hypoosmia, which is the decreased sense of smell, and then dysosmia, which is much rarer, but it's a change in sensation of smell. And that I want to just point as a side, but very disturbing effect that COVID-19 survivors can suffer from, and that is parasomnia. And that is when somebody takes a smell that they're very familiar with and often very comforting or enjoyable, such as coffee, and then it changes to something that's either very noxious, such as gasoline. Okay, so there's a disconnect between what the brain's expecting and then what ends up getting sensed. Phantasmia is the perception that there's no stimulus at all, even, and then that even without that, say the smell of rotting fish or ammonia can come up. So what is the evidence for COVID-19 related anosmia in the brain? Well, there was some really nice work that was done last year looking at this in both humans and hamsters. And what this study found, and these are our viral particles here that are circles, that's VP, is that they saw that COVID-19 actually caused loss of the hairs, the cilia, in the olfactory epithelium in hamsters. So it does not appear that the viral particles attack the neurons themselves, so much that it attacks the supporting cells, and that's how it causes loss of olfaction. And this is in a human over here. These are again pointing towards viral particles, but this is in a patient who had prolonged anosmia after 196 days, and they still found viral particles, and that was thought to be associated with the loss of smell for such a prolonged duration. So what does this have to do with Alzheimer's? Well, there's been a lot of growing evidence, and then a really nice study came out from the Baltimore group from their longitudinal aging study showing that loss of smell is linked to Alzheimer's cognitive impairment biomarkers. In fact, loss of smell was associated with a 22% increased risk of developing mild cognitive impairment. And interestingly, these participants, and of note, they did not have dementia at baseline. If they had lower olfactory scores, they were much more likely to develop higher levels of Alzheimer's pathology in the brain as detected by brain scans. And this was noted to be more outstanding in regions associated with olfaction and memory. Very similar, curiously, to what the SARS-CoV-2 imaging study saw. All right, so with those sort of threads in our mind, the pressing question is this: does if somebody gets a COVID-19 infection and gets olfactory dysfunction, are they at higher risk for Alzheimer's dementia or other types of dementias? And if so, how is this happening? So the jury is still kind of out. We're still investigating that sort of, 3-step pathway. But there is some growing evidence that those who have olfactory dysfunction, they may have reduced or mild cognitive deficits. But the bottom line is that this is going to need to be studied more, but there is some growing evidence suggesting a connection between those. And the mechanism, again, still being studied, but as you saw from the earlier electron micrograph of the sequelae getting destroyed by the viral particles, what is thought to be here is these purple cells here are thought to be the neurons themselves. But like all cells, neurons need a lot of support. They need supporting cells to help nurture them. They need blood flow to help, keep the vasculature going to help support the neurons. So what we think happens is that the SARS-CoV-2 infects the pericytes, i.e. these supporting cells, also causes damage in the vascular. That causes infection and death as well of the other supporting cells. And this causes a huge release of inflammation. And then that causes the neurons to either die or to act, in a dysfunctional way, which is why we kind of see those parasomnias. And the next question is this, right? We would think that if, anosmia is such a prevalent symptom, right, about 50%, the frequency would increase with greater severity of illness. But at least one study points to a very intriguing thought that actually COVID-19 olfactory dysfunction is actually more common in those with a mild form, as much as 85.9, versus they found in moderate to people with moderate to critical COVID-19 illness was in the 5% range. So this argues that perhaps the mechanisms for disease severity may not be the same. And moreover, we do think that the cognitive symptoms in long haulers could differ based on severity. And even at the beginning of the pandemic, the headlines were already reporting that people who did survive the ICU after having had COVID-19 really faced a prolonged recovery, even longer than those, who are normally in the ICU with other severe types of infections. And in a pretty massive study done about a year ago now, they looked at electronic health records for COVID-19 survivors. And they essentially corroborated, what we mentioned earlier. That is, for the first time, about 33.6% of patients received their cognitive diagnosis for the first time after being infected with COVID-19. And as we mentioned earlier, there seems to be something specific about COVID-19, the risk of various types of strokes, brain hemorrhage, infection, and dementia versus influenza seems to be much greater, nearly about twofold greater. And even compared to other types of respiratory tract infections, it was again about twofold higher. So there seems to, once again, and these are people hospitalized as well, seems to be something very specific in terms of the effects on the brain from COVID-19. And we also see this as well from a psychiatric standpoint, first-time mood, anxiety, psychotic disorder, substance use, and insomnia. Again, there seems to be some kind of effect that COVID-19 has specifically on the brain compared to the flu or other types of respiratory tract infections. And there is a difference based on severity. So what we see here is that if somebody had COVID-19 and was not hospitalized versus somebody who was hospitalized was more than twofold more likely to develop dementia. And similarly, if somebody needed ICU admission, they also ended up having a twofold higher risk of developing dementia down the road. And then if someone developed acute confusion in the hospital with COVID-19, about a fourfold difference there. And a similar effect was also seen for psychiatric diagnoses. All right, so more evidence now coming out suggesting that these effects are not short-term. So this is a study looking at the one-year trajectory of cognitive change in older survivors from COVID-19 in Wuhan, China. So they essentially did telephone screens to see what was going on. And what they found was that people who were quite ill, people who required hospitalization, they had nearly a fivefold risk of early onset cognitive decline, but there was also a delayed effect as well. So even later on, that effect was seen eightfold, and then more concerningly, it was progressive, so 19-fold. So those people who are hospitalized do seem to be at higher risk. Now, there is some risk for those who are not hospitalized. It appears to be around twofold, but this points to, COVID-19 having longitudinal effects, at least in those who are hospitalized. All right, so I'm going to cover in a little more detail now the last two pathways, but as I'm going to discuss a little bit more, it's really hard to separate these two, and we're going to go into why that is. So to begin to wrap our mind around the problems of why hospitalized COVID-19 survivors, end up with much more severe cognitive symptoms, it's worth breaking down the problem into as follows. We think about infection, and then severe critical illness. And then that leads to some sort of acute pathology in terms of disease severity. And then finally, the long-term sequelae. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, the two-hit hypothesis really focuses on the concept that people who are already at higher risk, were at higher risk for Alzheimer's, even for COVID-19 infection, they get COVID-19, and that then tips them over the edge. And one of the challenges as we begin to study why COVID, or does COVID-19 cause Alzheimer's, we're going to have to tease out some environmental effects. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, what we found is that the people who are more likely to get infected to begin with were those already at higher risk. We don't fully understand entirely why, but people who are in more rural areas, people who had lower education, probably because of occupational exposure, and then people who had racial ethnic disparities, so namely Blacks and Hispanics, they were more likely to also get infected, just probably due to, again, workplace exposure, not being able to work at home. And then the genetic and immunologic vulnerabilities, we do think that those people as well may have some sharing of who ended up getting infected versus not. And those people may also have a difference in risk of developing dementia. So what makes the problem very complicated to understand is that if you wanted to really study something fairly, right, you would have a group that's infected that's all at equal risk. But unfortunately, due to the social, economic, and health disparities of the pandemic, we started off by infecting a group that was already at higher risk for dementia. And then if we want to take a look at a moment for the risk for severe COVID illness, right, the types of people who got sick, it's not equal altogether, right? These are people with underlying premorbid conditions, age being a slightly tricky one. We know that naturally older people are more likely to develop severe critical COVID illness, but on the other hand, more of them have gotten vaccinated. But if we, again, continue to conceptualize along the same standpoint of the two-hit hypothesis, it's not an even distribution. So those who develop severe critical illness are also having the same risk factors for Alzheimer's dementia. So people who are older, Again, racial and ethnic disparities. As we talked about earlier, dementia, neurodegenerative disorder. Another huge one is vascular disease and obesity. So again, those are well-known risk factors for Alzheimer's. Again, much more likely to develop severe critical illness. And then genetic risk factors as well. We'll talk about that in a moment, but people who had ApoE4 genotype, a well-known risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's, were also much more likely to get critically ill. And then I think environment also plays a difference. We know that people with access to healthcare, differential effects there. What do I mean by that? So for example, a lot of the COVID-19 therapeutics, access to those to prevent severe illness, that really varied widely across the country. And once again, people who lived in more rural areas with poor access to healthcare were less likely to get those prophylactic COVID-19 therapeutics, such as monoclonal antibodies, and then were much more likely to go on to get severely ill. And then finally, psychiatric disorders as a premorbid condition, both a risk factor for both dementia and critical illness. And you can see how the societal and environmental interactions there, again, sort of weigh the population that ends up critically sick as already being a very high risk population for Alzheimer's and other dementias. Okay, so I've begun to lay out here conceptually a little bit more in detail where we're thinking about. But if you think about those people as they get sicker and sicker from their illness, they're much more likely to have sequelae that will increase their overall risk for Alzheimer's dementia. So the sicker somebody is, the more delirious they are, the higher their risk of dementia. Likewise, metabolic abnormalities, hypoxia, those effects are more likely with increasing severity of illness, again, increasing the risk for Alzheimer's dementia. And then we'll talk a little bit more about treatment-related effects as well. So stroke actually was seen for the first time in people without any known risk factors if they had been infected with COVID-19. It's a phenomenon that we're still wrapping our minds around, but does appear to be related to the vascular effects from SARS-CoV-2 infection. Can include acute ischemic stroke, cerebral sinus thrombostrokes, intracerebral hemorrhage. And again, as I mentioned earlier, those with severe and critical illness from COVID-19 are much more likely to develop that stroke and much more, again, more likely to develop dementia. And I talked about impaired consciousness or delirium. That prevalence was really high. Again, it seems to be variant dependent, maybe less so with Omicron, but the prevalence was still like 37% for those hospitalized in the ICU. And again, it is thought to be due to inflammation, hypoxia, in some cases, even seizures, very less likely infection, though, and we'll talk about that as well in a little bit. So as we start to wrap our mind around, the causes behind disease severity leading to dementia, we can characterize it as follows: acute brain injury of some kind, whether it be stroke, hypoxia, anoxia, metabolic disturbances, whether it be kidney failure, for example, disturbances in sodium and potassium that we see with severe illness. Those can cause cognitive impairment. Prolonged delirium, as I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 patients who are quite ill tend to have much longer periods of delirium than those who do not have COVID-19. And then finally, neuroinflammation. So another complicating factor as we begin to understand whether there's a relationship between COVID-19 infection and Alzheimer's is trying to understand the role of treatment. Unfortunately, those who become sicker with COVID-19 are much more likely to require treatments, some of which we know have long-term cognitive sequelae. So, for example, we do know that those with prolonged mechanical ventilation, for whatever reason, do tend to have long-term cognitive deficits. And then often, especially in the ICU, medications that are associated with cognitive impairment have to be administered for life-saving reasons, but can still have effects, include benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, corticosteroids. And then finally, there's still a lot that we don't know. So we don't know what the long-term cognitive effects of convalescent plasma, monoclonal antibodies, and antivirals are. And so one of the challenges of researchers is being able to control and parse out those aspects when we try to understand if somebody who has been hospitalized or in the ICU, what role is treatment having in terms of their cognition. So then finally, those who are sicker often tend to develop more long-term sequelae. What do I mean by this? So we mean persistent hypercoagulability. Those people are more likely to have recurrent blood clots, and that is thought to affect all parts of the vasculature, including the brain. There's growing evidence that COVID-19 infection can cause cardiomyopathies, as well as long-term pulmonary damage, as well as persistent inflammation in the brain and throughout the body, as well as psychiatric sequelae. And all of those factors themselves can then go on to lead potentially to cognitive decline and dementia. So this is why the people who are hospitalized are probably in a different category, because their disease, hasn't really stopped. There's other factors at play. So earlier I showed a picture of how anosmia potentially theoretically arose from the SARS-CoV-2 virus infecting the supporting cells of the olfactory bulb. And it would feel intuitive, I think, to say, well, the sicker somebody is, the higher their viral loads of SARS-CoV-2, and it must be showing up in the CSF. And if somebody's still having all these persistent symptoms of COVID, it must be because there's virus in the cerebrospinal fluid. But I've just taken one example here, and there's a number of other studies that have also supported that there really doesn't seem to be persistent viral presence, at least in high levels, in the CSF. And this argues that we need to figure out other reasons for why COVID is causing long-term damage, particularly in those who have been hospitalized and in the ICU. So one thought about how this may arise is that COVID-19 may exert effects through what we call the indirect pathway. So previously what I showed was the direct pathway in which the virus manages to infect the CNS. But this one does not actually require direct CNS invasion. Essentially what happens is that SARS-CoV-2 binds to the ACE2 receptor in the blood vessels, in the lining of the blood vessels. The lining is known as the endothelium. So it binds there and it gains entry. And then from there, it triggers this pathways that essentially cause these abnormal clots. Okay, and this is what's thought to actually lead to the strokes, for example. And that coagulation cascade is also accompanied by neuroinflammation. And then eventually these two changes together causes long-term damage to the neurons, as well as the chemical signaling that occurs between the neurons. And then that is thought to lead to actually both the cognitive and the psychiatric sequelae that we see. So here's the challenging question. If there are not high viral loads in the CSF or even throughout the body after the resolution of the acute phase of COVID-19, how is it possible that COVID-19 can continue to cause damage in people? We don't fully know the answer, but at least one theory speculates that what is happening is after the virus, is produced here in the cell. As we talked about, the viruses have to hijack the cell. There's a way of essentially storing these viral particles in what we call extracellular vesicles. And then they can get stored in various parts in the body in what we call reservoirs and remain hidden essentially to detection. And then over time, if these extracellular vesicles can release the viruses or release essentially the damaging factors from the virus. And that is thought to be able to cause long-term inflammation, hypoxia, and hypercoagulability. And we see here, again, just in a little bit more detail, this concept in which the extracellular vesicles have been stored, but are now later on, again, after this is after the acute infection is over, they get released, and it causes that clotting and, again, that inflammation. And this is at least one of the hypothetical pathways on how COVID-19 could cause long-term damage. This is a MRI imaging, actually high resolution of a brain here, showing that blood vessel injury. This is from autopsy. This was done much earlier in the pandemic, but essentially justifies the idea that perhaps this indirect pathway is playing a significant role in patients who have critical illness that is pointing away from the model of the virus directly infecting the brain. So I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to actually separate these two different pathways. We like to cleanly, pull these threads apart as scientists for study purposes, but in reality, it's really difficult. And why is that? Well, one reason is because the very same risk factors that might set somebody up for a higher risk of dementia, such as ApoE4, it might also go on to increase their risk of severe illness. So it's very, very difficult to pull apart these two pathways. A really good example was a study that came out from a group in Finland showing that ApoE4 was associated with increased risk of severe COVID. And then on autopsy, they found a greater number of cerebral microhemorrhages, again, supporting this indirect pathway of vascular injury, but also pointing to the difficulty of being able to separate the idea of a two-hit hypothesis from disease severity. Those two pathways may actually be linked. So where do we stand now? Well, I think, unfortunately, this headline, which was published, several months ago, is still the pressing issue. Long COVID is going to be a major factor in terms of both our society and how our healthcare system handles the next influx of patients. And I think the question is, where's the research going to take us? So I'm part of a collaborative group with Dr. Barbara Kahn, who's an ICU doctor, Dr. Shannon Richter, who I think many of you may know is the neuroimaging core leader for Indiana Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And we are doing a number of studies looking at blood and neuroimaging to see whether there is a relationship, in this case, between ICU factors such as COVID-19 delirium and the development of Alzheimer's. This is part of a greater portfolio of work funded by the NIH. Probably the most notable one is a national cohort called Recover, administered through NYU, which is looking at COVID-19 and long haulers, symptoms and potential treatments. And how are we going to understand these complex pathways? I just said, we try to neatly separate these things out scientifically, but in reality, we know that these pathways are connected. And this is where I think the future with artificial intelligence and analysis with electronic health records are going to be really essential. So there's another ongoing study funded by the NIH called N3C, which is trying to analyze the development of long haulers COVID-19 symptoms using AI. So I think I just want to take a moment, because I think this was a very difficult talk, especially for those of you out there who are affected by long COVID or know somebody who is affected by long COVID and having to care for them. And I think as though we're, very clearly anxious to get the answer to the question, is COVID-19 tied to Alzheimer's. I think there's also a lot of hope, and that hope is in the research that our center is doing and that other NIH-funded investigators are doing. So I hope you found this talk informative, and next year we hope to have some updates on what the research is bringing on the latest treatments and understanding of the pathophysiology on whether COVID-19 is linked to Alzheimer's. Thank you so much, and I hope you'll stay on for our Q&A.
Okay, well, I want to thank folks for staying on. I think that talk may have been a little bit more intense on the scientific end, but I think it also brings a lot of the questions that people have asked me when I work with them clinically, like what's causing symptoms from COVID even after their acute symptoms go away. If you do have any questions, you can certainly drop them in the Q&A. And I think one thing is that we're going to have to see how this works out in the bigger picture for our society. I thought it was very telling that in the New England Journal of Medicine articles that they think anywhere from 10 to 30% of people are going to be affected, and I think the U.S. has been disproportionately affected, and we're going to have to see where this comes out. So, in terms of next steps, people, folks ask me what are crucial to answering the complexity of the questions of COVID. This is going to really require a lot of collaboration, I think, in a lot of different ways. We're going to need people who understand social and racial and health disparities. As I pointed out, part of what was challenging is in studying questions, not just biology. There's the biology part that we went up, but there's also the health disparities part, and that's going to have to be understood on both sides. So I think what we'll do now at this point is I want to thank everybody for coming to the last talk. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up because I don't see any questions. If you have any questions, you can certainly contact our center. So this talk will be posted on, oh, wait, I just said that there's a question. Okay, so let me answer this question and then we can perhaps wrap up. So is there a potential for a false diagnosis and of Alzheimer's dementia as a result of sequelae of COVID-19? That is a really challenging question. So it's really crucial, I think, to have people who understand, to have a healthcare professional who does the cognitive assessment, who understands these questions. There's three possibilities, and I pointed this out. The first one is that somebody may have had like some mild symptoms that predispose them towards Alzheimer's and COVID pushed them over, right? So it could have been that COVID pushed them over and they actually do have Alzheimer's dementia now, but COVID, didn't obviously help in any way. The second possibility is that the cognitive symptoms, they don't have Alzheimer's and it looks like COVID. It's going to be really difficult to tell, I think, if somebody has memory deficits similar to COVID, unless they do really detailed neuropsychological testing. So just to back up, neuropsychological testing is about 2 to 3 hours of testing for to sort out the details, and they might be able to sort it out there. Where we eventually will need to go, and we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but I think Dr. Jeff Dage's talk started to touch on, is the need for blood biomarkers, right? So the need for blood biomarkers to diagnose Alzheimer's, to see if someone at least has the changes in their blood that could be suggestive of that pathway as opposed to something else. And there's a third possibility. The third possibility is somebody could have Alzheimer's as well as additional cognitive damage from COVID. And I don't think at this juncture, the tools that we have, minus a really good history combined with very detailed testing, can help. Now, if people are doing research studies, that's something that can be sort of answered on the side because they can do scans to look for the presence of beta amyloid, or they can get cerebral spinal fluid to look. But in the younger people who have COVID, and have cognitive symptoms, they actually see changes in inflammation. They don't actually see markers that are suggestive of Alzheimer's. So that problem wouldn't, this risk of misdiagnosis is much lower, I think, in someone who's younger, as long as they're assessed by somebody who's very experienced. So, all right. Well, I want to thank everyone for their time, and I think we can wrap up. Please don't hesitate to email if you have any other questions. And thank you so much for coming to Memory University this year.
I'd like to thank all of you so much for joining us for my talk and for the Q&A. You'll receive a survey after the webinar, so please take a few minutes to share your feedback so that way we can better fulfill your requests and needs for Memory U talks in the future. And I also want to encourage all of you to stay in touch with our center. You can either email us with questions or your thoughts. You can give us a call, check out our website, and you can follow us on Twitter and our Facebook. If you didn't have a chance to hear this talk, because you may have missed part of it, or if you wanted to listen to the recording for this talk or any of the other previous talks, please follow us on our Facebook. We'll be posting all these videos a few weeks after each of the sessions. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing all of you next year.